In this lesson, I'm going to echo the importance of working with all three aspects of color with hue, saturation, and brightness, but this time it's focused on the contrast between the three. We are all familiar with this brightness or value scale, charting levels of brightness from black to white and having a neutral gray as the midpoint. So when we add in a black, neutral gray, and white dot to each scale, it should be pretty easy seeing where the contrast stands out the most. The far left one has white having the strongest contrast, and the black dot is not even visible. And same for the far right side, with the black standing out the most and the white blending in. And if we look at the middle, the neutral gray dot blends in. The dots are still there, it's all a matter of contrast, and this one only deals with the brightness contrast. Something interesting with the neutral gray dot is that it appears the strongest against the darkest and brightest scale, and that contrast works both ways. So if you're working on a piece and you want a neutral to stand out, surround it with either a higher or a lower brightness selection. Or if you want your darkest or brightest area to be your focal point, surround it with a neutral. Now if we pull up a color scale example, the same theory applies but with a focus on hue transitioning. And if we remember, when mixing opposite hues on the modern color wheel, it will result in a neutral gray. But since these aren't perfectly complementary, it won't mix perfectly to a neutral gray, but will result in some saturation shifting naturally. Looking at this, it's easy to see that the purple has the highest contrast against the far yellow, and vice versa. But rather than having such a high contrast, look at how the middle selections have the most harmony within them, and that's due to the low contrast in brightness, but higher contrast with hue. So now let's make it a little harder to distinguish the contrast. Alright, so for this one, it should be fairly easy to tell that the red stands out more than the blue. But why is that exactly? It has nothing to do with the brightness or saturation, as they are exactly the same, and we can test that on our color picker. The only difference is the hue, and since this red is further away on the color wheel than this blue in comparison to the purple, the contrast gives red more attention. So what about this middle one? They all appear to be very similar in tone, but we can see there's an obvious hue difference. This one becomes kind of tricky. By definition, the green should have the greatest amount of contrast, but the purple dot does stand out almost just as much, if not more, when just looking at it. But we can double check that with our color picker here. They each have the same saturation and brightness, but the hue contrast makes the difference, just like the first set. And this is when color can start to become more relative to the viewer. So this one, the green dot does have the most contrast, but it wouldn't be crazy if someone perceived the purple as having the most contrast. Lastly, we have two very different dots. The top one has a different hue and a lighter brightness, while the bottom one has the same hue but a much darker brightness level. So which has the higher amount of contrast? I'll let you decide. But when it becomes harder to tell, this is when colors start to have poor relationships with one another and can create a clashing of color. If you're ever second guessing things such as what we are seeing here, then you may have a color dilemma. And just to see here, if we turn the grayscale layer on, you can see how the first two are indistinguishable in terms of brightness contrast, but the third one stands out with the dark value heavily contrasting the scale it's located on. Pulling up the common mistake of having a poor relationship, I want you to start seeing how we can easily fix this. The first step would be give some hue contrast and complement the red. So let's choose a cooler color to start out with. Now don't stop here. You may have a good start, but the subject matter still blends in with the background since the saturation and brightness are still so similar and have little contrast. So for our next step, let's turn down the saturation and up the brightness so that all three aspects of color are taking effect. And now you can see how the sphere seems to stand out more, and I'm sure you already know why that is. Contrast. So for one last time, contrast can be handled in the three aspects of color, and if your pieces ever appear flat, it is because one, if not more of these, have a poor contrast to them. And every color has an opposite contrast in hue, saturation, and brightness. So no longer can you use the excuse of your work looking flat. Just go ahead and add some contrast.